We have time for one more.
And then we're all going to my place. We have a large bed.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to introduce the writer and director of the report, Scott Burns.
Thanks. I get to introduce Norman Lear.
I'm going to use both of them.
Thank you!
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you for coming.
Oh, God, my pleasure. How'd you like the film? To a civil society or what?
Thank you. Do you want to ask me questions first, or should I ask you questions?
Well, first, I just want to say I think the film is wonderful. I saw the last 25 minutes again, but I'd seen the film a couple of weeks ago, and I think I mentioned to you, Scott, I was stunned because it seemed like a documentary, as if all of the footage was historically the footage. How you managed to make that film in a storyteller's fashion today, I mean, I don't know. I thought again and again the truth will out, and you did that.
Well, I think part of the way we did it was we actually didn't make it with a studio. And with that in mind, I'm going to ask you a question that I've always wanted to ask. So, like in 1963, you wrote "Come Blow Your Own Horn," right?
Was that the year?
Yeah. I prepared. And then
Come Blow Your Horn was starred Frank Sinatra,
Yeah.
and a young actor making his first. Tony Bill, I don't know if
Wow.
you can remember.
But then, a few years later, you make All in the Family. But in between, aside from a movie about divorce, I'm just wondering, did the 1960s have an impact on you that made you start sort of seeing TV as an opportunity to talk about the things that you talked about in all of those TV shows?
I'm going to answer that question, then we're going to get back to you. Because this evening is about you and your work. I think the overall answer to that question is, I was born at a time, 1922. I was born at a time when we loved America for what it was about. We had civics in school when I was a boy. I learned what my Bill of Rights, my Constitution, the First Amendment, et cetera, was all about as a kid. And when December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor hit, I couldn't wait to enlist to fight for everything I just mentioned. Not love of country without understanding what the country was all about. Love of country because it made the promises it made, which it has fought to keep. Unfortunately, we still have a lot of promises to keep, but they're there. So everything I've been came out of that feeling of love of country and all of its love of America and all of its promises. Back to you. This film that we just saw is such a giant contribution to those promises, reminding us, yes. It's a wonderful piece of work, and I'm so grateful to you for it.
Well, thank you. I mean, the reason why I'm curious about that is I was thinking when I asked you to do this that, I got to grow up, I'm a pretty shitty guitar player, but I remember having a conversation with somebody once about, the difference between Stevie Ray Vaughan's version of Little Wing and Jimi Hendrix's version of Little Wing. And if you've heard them both, they're both amazing. But the advantage that Stevie Ray Vaughan is that he got to listen to Jimi Hendrix's version. And it's still unclear to me what Jimi Hendrix was listening to. And I got to watch your TV shows. And I got to grow up knowing that someone took television and took this incredible tool that got into people's homes, and that they somehow were able to use that to tell stories that made a huge difference. I mean, it is very hard for me to imagine sitting here having made this without having grown up, seeing everything from All in the Family to Cold Turkey to,
But we all walk in on the shoulders of those who preceded us. I had my heroes too. And, I don't know how many people in this room would remember Walter Lippmann, who was one of the great journalists, and Reston, and all the people of the filmmakers that preceded me. Not so much television, but film. And all the Stanley Kramers of my life, at whose knees I grew up.
Well, I kind of want to open it up for questions, but did we get another microphone, or is there, you can just yell and I'll repeat it if you want.
Okay. First, thank you very much for doing all this research on this. It was spectacular in terms of the detail that you went through to get people to understand what happened. So my question is, have you researched this issue now? Are there black ops sites now in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in the Middle East? Do you know that at all?
So now I get to do something that is in a Woody Allen film. So there's, Adam Driver plays Daniel Jones in the movie, and rather than me answer that question, Sarah, will you get Dan? You guys should meet Dan.
To answer the question, are there sites like this today? At the end of the film, Scott mentioned something called the McCain-Feinstein Act. And what that does is it requires International Committee of the Red Cross access now to detainees almost immediately upon their capture, which basically eliminates the ability to lawfully detain someone secretly. So no, I don't think that's happening right now. Very good question.
I somehow feel that there's going to be more questions. Less questions for me. Yes?
Did you understand how hard the CIA is going to come down on you for doing this? do you have any clue, even having made this film, of what's about? And I'm not threatening you. I'm so amazed.
It feels like you are. I guess I don't really, that was never a thing that I thought about. And I would encourage, and I'm sure Norman has feelings about this as well, if there's something you're really passionate about, like kids in cages or corrupt politicians, or I could go on for another hour, those are all movies, and I hope that you will tell them.
How about enhanced interrogation techniques? If that isn't one of the great jokes of our time.
No, one of the things that's kind of unusual about my experience on this is I started out writing a whole other movie. I was going to write a movie about the two psychologists, and it was going to be a very dark kind of comedy, kind of like Catch-22, which I always loved. And it was the language in Joseph Heller's book, like people named Major, Minor. But yeah, a phrase like enhanced interrogation, was something like and I know there's at least one other one here, as a former copywriter, it was like a secret drop of retsin or something, which also doesn't exist in the world. So yeah, the language part of it was a big deal to me. I mean, there's a little moment early on where, Bruce Justin's character says I, did, what does he say, actual simulations? Yeah, which, I mean, I did put those words in his mouth, but that really was his resume. And when you think about what an actual simulation is, these guys never did an interrogation. And if you're old enough to remember, think back to what it felt like in 2002 and how we were taught to be terrified. And the person that we send in out of our entire country to keep all of us safe is someone whose interrogation experience consists of doing simulations. It's just staggering to me that was, it's sort of, for me, when I found that out, and the way that I got to Dan is, I started looking at the report, because I'd started this a little before the report came out, which was in early December of 2014, and I was able to get a hold of Dan a couple of months later, going through Senator Feinstein's office, and I would ask him questions about the report, and eventually it really stopped being funny, as you can see.
Thank you. So, Scott, you've written a number of movies, and this is your first directorial debut. And I was very struck at how visually adept it was, and how you really use the visuals to tell the story. Everything from color grading to show that it's the past, when it's a little grimier, to all the great close-ups to really just show every emotion. How do you approach the visual style of this film, and how important was it for you that the visuals pop as much as the writing?
I'm so glad we planted you. I knew when I saw your audition you were going to be the guy.
Oh my God.
That was really kind of you. It means a lot to me as a writer, because I think, and I'm sure there are other writers in the room who, you somehow feel that once you, understand what a comma and a period are for, everybody assumes that you must be visually inept. And I was actually a director before I was a screenwriter. I directed television commercials, but I came to understand, when to get in and when to get out from doing that. And I think I wrote because I couldn't draw or paint very well, and cameras allowed me to express myself visually. So it was something that, anyway, it was really nice of you to say that. Thank you. Thanks. Yes?
Okay, so writer question. Now you're involved with this, and if I go by other movies in the genre where you think of All the President's Men, where they're working and they're going outside to do all the investigating in a big, huge office and stuff like that. And then this fine gentleman did everything in a windowless room in a basement and really couldn't talk to anyone. From your writer's perspective, how did you turn that into such this big scope that we all saw?
Again, another piece of brain. You know, I think what we did with this script, just before I wrote this, I had written a play in New York called The Library, and in the theater you get to read your script out loud over and over and over again, and you really hear the language in a way that we don't generally get to do, at least in film. I know that people on TV do table reads, but very rarely in film do you have people together to do that. And I knew that because there wasn't going to be a lot of action here, that this had to be about how it sounded and where I got out of the scene and what question that scene asked and how the next scene, you know, needed to answer it, but in a way that you didn't expect it, and when to go, you know. So all of that stuff, I mean, you know, Jennifer Fox, my producer, who's also here somewhere. Okay, maybe not. Maybe not. She really encouraged us to, you know, me to keep doing table reads, and so that had a lot to do with it. And then I always felt that the moment that he goes to the lawyer was sort of a big pivot in the film, because it's when he leaves the windowless room. And I kept looking for a location, and it was actually the last location we found. It was after we had started shooting, and I was getting a lot of pressure to commit to a place. And then we found this location that was actually a law office in New York, where all of the deposition rooms were all glass. And I thought, oh, this is perfect. He goes from a windowless room to a room that is all windows. And it, you know, and then when I saw that, I thought, oh, that should be the moment where we cross the line with the camera, because that's the only place in the film where we did that. And so a lot of it was, you know, the good thing was, you know, again, by not working with the studio, you were able to make changes on the fly that are, I think, harder for many of us because of some of the ways that the process is now legislated.
What does the Z stand for?
Zachary. There's another Scott Burns in the guild, and so I had to.
So you made up the name Zachary?
No, my parents made up the name Zachary because.
Oh, Zachary.
Yeah.
I thought you said Zachary.
No, Zachary. It was my Uncle Zalmy, and I'm just glad my parents didn't go with Zalmy. That would have sucked.
Thank you so much for making an incredible movie. I think it's a piece of art. I wonder if you got the chance to actually meet with CIA agent and like with people who were involved in writing the report.
Do you want to answer your experience?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think the question was how much did Scott interact with CIA agents, and Scott just threw him out. I think it's important to know that, you know, while I think our Senate report is critical of the agency, and I think Scott's film reflects that, as you all just saw. The agency, like any other large organization, is made up of a very diverse workforce, and the report wouldn't have been written without people coming forward and saying, look at this email, make sure you find that memo. In the film, Tim Blake Nelson fills that role, but there were many Tim Blake Nelsons in real life. So in regards to could this have been made without the CIA, no, the report itself, obviously 6.3 million pages is what this was based on, and you really did need people to come in and say, you should make sure you see this or that.
The other thing to follow on that is by the time I got to this story, George Tenet, Jose Rodriguez, Mike Morrell, Jim Mitchell, while I was doing it, all wrote books. And all of their books, and I'm going to plug Amazon. First of all, I want to thank Amazon for allowing us to show the movie to you guys, and also for, you know, buying it at Sundance and giving it an actual life. So a big thank you to them. But if you go and you look up those people's books, you'll notice they're all co-written by the same guy, and his name is Bill Harlow. And Bill Harlow was the PR person for the CIA. And the thing that's striking about all those books, if you do go and look at them, is there's not a redaction anywhere. And they all basically tell the same story. But if you go to Ali Soufan's book, Black Banners, you will see that most of it is redacted. So my question, because they were both, all of those books went before what they call a PRB, which is a publication review board. So if they all went before the same PRB, how come the CIA books all tell the exact same story and are, not redacted? But when Ali tries to talk about his experience, because I did speak to him about interrogation, he gets half his book crossed out.
How do you answer that question?
The CIA is, like us, is in the business of storytelling, and they have their own narrative about what happened, and I feel that the part of the function of that narrative is to justify their continued existence.
In their narrative, do they cover the torture, or do they skip it?
Do you want to talk about their response?
Sure, Scott has this a little bit in his film, which is this back and forth at one point between the CIA and the Senate, what we called the Summer of Hell. And it went on for many months, and at the end of that, in the film, Senator Feinstein says to Adam Driver, stop meeting with them. And one of the things that Scott, I think, was in the script at one point, but taken out, the next thing she said is, but make them own their response. And they did provide a written response, and if you go and buy the report, where you download it for free, you'll see it has over 2,725 footnotes. Most of those are to the CIA's own records, but a lot of those footnotes actually talk about what the June 2013 position is of the CIA on their issues of torture, and it's a shocking document, and you really should read the footnotes with the report.
But yeah, I mean, they maintain that the program worked, even to this time.
That the program?
Yeah.
They call it a program.
They call it a program.
Torture's a program, folks.
You touched on two things that I thought about, because right before 9/11, I was actually developing a cartoony TV show about terrorists. And the two questions I had after 9/11 were, one, how is it possible that nobody foresaw the use of planes? We had so many plots involving terrorists using planes, we had to call a moratorium on them. And it had been attempted 2 years prior when a lone wolf took a plane over. And secondly, how did they ever think that torture would work when you bring it up in the film? It was so clear that it didn't work, and there were so many other sophisticated techniques for interrogating people that it seems like by torturing they forewent those more useful methods.
Well, one of the things that Dan talked to me about, and it's in the film at one point, is they don't seem to have a lot of awareness of their own history. Because if they did, they would see that coercive measures didn't work in Latin America and torture didn't work in Vietnam. And if you go back even further, you'll find that in World War II, a war in which you fought, we actually tried and I believe killed the Japanese for using these exact techniques on our soldiers.
Right.
So there's the hypocrisy of that. But even more than that, when they were used in Korea also against our airmen, it was very specifically for one reason, which was to get false confessions. And there's a problem with that I didn't realize until I spoke to Dan and Ali Soufan and other intelligence people, which is once you have bad intel in the stream, what do you do with it? Like, you can't ignore it as a politician, because then, God forbid, something goes wrong and you didn't act on this intel. So you now have to devote resources to what ostensibly, I might call bullshit. And I'll give you a really great example of this. So in the interrogation of KSM, there was a plot to take down the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is a plot that the CIA, claims to have foiled. This plot involved people going up on the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge, and I'm assuming most of you have seen the Brooklyn Bridge. There's a lot of cables, with torches and cutting through them, which would take the better part of a day. So if you can imagine, an army of people climbing up those undetected and then spending a day with an acetylene tool, like, clearly this was not a great plot, a credible plot, thank you. And yet, it was something where I'm sure a lot of police and FBI were stationed on the bridge getting paid overtime because you had to deal with it. It's like the Montana plot that we have in the film, which is, I wish I could say I made that up, but it's, that was a thing. Yeah. Way in the back on the aisle.
I guess this is a question for Dan, and also I guess for you in the writing. How close were you to actually slipping the report to the New York Times? And then how much, I guess, was fictional license that you took in telling the story?
What? You want me to start?
Yeah.
The part of that scene that is that's the most accurate is the term where the New York Times reporter says to Adam, if we had your report, we would print it all tomorrow. There was a period of time where the press was really eager to get their hands on this report. There were reporters outside of my house. And at one point, someone in DC who was a senior person at a newspaper said those exact words, which is, we've had a meeting and we've discussed it. What would we do if we had this report? And the person told me, if we had it tomorrow morning, every bit of it would be printed. But I was really committed to doing it the right way and getting it out through proper channels. Of course, you think of things all the time, but in anything in life, right, you think about things that you don't do. And I think that scene, I'll let Scott describe that scene, it was kind of like going through your head. And when it came out of your discussions with other staff and senators, I believe, right? Yeah. I'll let you take it.
Well, your question about what's fictionalized was sort of overall, right?
No.
Or just that scene?
Specifically or overall, how do you approach it?
Overall, my approach was when we were talking about the program, if I could take dialogue, or words directly from the report, I did. So pretty much everything that deals with the CIA's program came directly from the work that Dan and his colleagues did. As for Dan's life, I wrote all of the scenes that I'm sure, you guys can think of, which are, Dan at home with an empty fridge, Dan at home with an angry partner, Dan in bed staring at the ceiling, Dan getting up very late and going to work. And they destroyed the claustrophobia that I sort of wanted to create in the windowless room by letting air in. And so, I love movies like Serpico and obviously like pretty much every other 1970s political thriller that I ripped shit off from. So yeah, that was sort of the handbook for what was made up. Yes?
I was struck by how little information we had about the character of Dan in the movie, and yet how emotional my response was to him. And how, like, especially early on, he never articulates like a big objective or a desire. By the end, it seems to be such an important thing, both to him and to me as a viewer, that there was a real power in the accrual. I wondered, as you were building the movie as a film, you have a lead we spend so much time with, we know almost nothing about, really. And he never really says, like, I'm gonna go climb that mountain, like, here I am, a lead with a plan. How did you navigate that in different cuts and different drafts? Was that part of your wrestling process? It's so elegant the way it came out.
Thank you. Well, I was trying to, this is what we were trying to do, is I wanted, what Annette had to do was convince you that she was Diane Feinstein. But because we shot the film in 26 days, we didn't have time for her to sit in a chair for 4 hours a day and like turn into Diane Feinstein. So, she and I talked about her voice because she really uses her voice for all of her characters. And then we threw her a wig. Put that on. Use that voice. And I think if we would have had more time, I mean, I was just so fortunate that she's so gifted. But Adam had a different challenge because, you know, the public didn't know who Dan Jones was. And that was also, when Adam and I talked about it, was an opportunity to build something from the ground up. It was funny, when we were corresponding with Dan on the movie, we were actually a little bit paranoid and didn't want, you know, people who saw emails to know we were talking to him. So we made up a pseudonym for Dan, which was Neil Marcus. And when I told Dan, I think got emails saying, "Who the hell's Neil Marcus?" And I told him what we were doing, and he said, my name's already Dan Jones.
How long did you did 26 days with a camera, but how long before that were you working?
4 years.
4 years.
Yeah.
So there's 5 years in that case.
Yeah. We have time for one more.
And then we're all going to my place. We have a large bed.
Yes.
Are we supposed to walk away with, does the enhanced interrogation not work? Or is it that the detainees didn't know anything in their innocence?
It's that the scene doesn't answer.
No, it's what? I'm sorry, but I just wanted to get interested. Sorry.
Well, you know, that's okay.
Is that a dumb question?
Well, no, there are no dumb questions. You know, I think what's important, I hope two things come away for people in this. Three. One is that, you know, our country, going back to George Washington, which is why I ended the film with Washington's order, which really happened, and I'm happy to tell you the story because we have to go, but...
I got that part of it right now.
Okay, so it's not us, but no, it doesn't work. There was no science that it worked. There was no actionable intelligence gathered from anybody. It wasn't because Al-Qaeda had somehow become gifted. I talked to a lot of military intelligence officers. They are the most offended at this. If you speak to anybody in the military, or if you're sitting here and you're going, I'm kind of left wing, maybe this shit's a good idea, it's strong and tough, maybe it doesn't work. And what it does is it puts our military at risk. And I can tell you that I interviewed Navy SEALs when I was doing this project, and what they said to me is, if I get captured, I am instructed to take a card out of my wallet with the Geneva Convention on it. And that says that you can't torture people. So how do I take that out of my pocket now and give it to somebody and expect to be treated like a human being? And so if you walk out of here with nothing else, realize that torture didn't help us, but will put our soldiers at risk for a generation. Oh, and my third thing before we go is the other thing that I really wanted to get across is, I think we all would agree, and certainly you would, that we're living in a moment where we have a stunning lack of accountability. And what I find so important about what Daniel did was, because of the rigor with which he did his work, he almost forced the senators to stand up and do their work. And it makes me feel a lot better at night knowing there are people still in our government who do their jobs and do them honorably, and do them with that kind of dignity. Because I believe that this crisis of accountability that we're living in right now goes back. Because once you stop holding people accountable, this tends to snowball. And so I hope the other thing that people take from this is that this moment, we are now in danger of turning it into all of our moments. So, anyway.
Thank you.